App settings are a huge deal in .NET Core. In fact, they're such a big deal, they often get overlooked. You see, Microsoft has been making a big effort to have great defaults for complex configurations. App settings is a great example of this. You can start using app settings with only a couple lines of code, and yet there's so much content to cover in this topic, I won't be able to cover all in this video. Actually, that's why I haven't covered this topic on its own yet. I wasn't sure how to get it done. So why do an intro video to get you started on a path towards understanding app settings better? But I hate to leave you there. Some of you might not need anything past the intro, but for those of you who are building apps in production, I want to be sure you're set up to succeed. So I took some time and did this right. I created a 4-hour course called .NET Core App Settings in Depth. I covered everything I'll cover in this video, plus I went into a lot more depth. Now, normally this course would be $49. However, we have 3 things to celebrate this week. First, we reached 10,000 customers on IamTimCorey.com. That's huge. My paid content helps fund my free content. In case you hadn't noticed, I've been able to do a lot more with a lot more quality recently. That's because of those 10,000 people, plus my Patreon members, plus those of you who watch ads in my videos. Speaking of you on YouTube, the second thing we're celebrating is hitting 175,000 subscribers. That's a lot of people who've been helped by my content. That number doesn't just happen. It comes from you sharing the videos, commenting on videos, liking my videos, even disliking, and even just watching my videos when they come out. Your participation pushes YouTube to share my content more widely. That helps more developers find the easier path to learning C#. So thank you for all of your support, however you give it. Because of you, we can make a difference in people's lives. I get messages all the time about lives that have been changed for the better because they saw my videos. That wouldn't be possible without your support. Now, that's only 2 reasons, but I said we have 3 reasons to celebrate. Well, the third reason isn't quite as dramatic, but yesterday was my birthday. So I decided, because all of you have done so much for me, to give you the birthday present this year. From now until the end of September, you can get my new course for just $29. That's $20 off. Now, for those of you who are in Europe or other countries that have VAT, that price is before VAT is applied. So your price might be a little bit different. I put the link in the description of this course with the coupon code applied. If you don't see a discount, use the coupon code CELEBRATE2020 at checkout. Remember, this only runs through the end of September. If you're watching this video after that date, I'm sorry you missed the sale, but you can sign up for my mailing list where you won't miss another sale. Okay, enough celebrating. We have code to get to. Let's jump right into Visual Studio. Let's start off by creating a new project. So new project, and we're going to create a Blazor app project. So if we come down here to Blazor app, hit next. Let's call this app settings demo, and the solution name will be intro to app settings. Hit create, and we're going to create a Blazor server app. Now, .NET Core app settings works in Razor pages, it works in MVC, it works in Blazor server, and it works in API. So there's 4 project types for the web that it works for. Now, it also works in console applications if you add a few configuration tweaks. We saw how to do that a couple of videos ago. We talked about setting the console up to be more powerful and using app settings and so on. Then it can also be used in worker services right out of the gate with no extra configuration necessary. And then for WinForm and WPF applications that are a .NET Core version, you can also use these, but you have to do a little extra configuration. But it's there, kind of hidden, but it is there, okay? So .NET Core has this built in. You can use it in pretty much any .NET Core project. The one exception would be Blazor WebAssembly because it runs fully on the client. So we can't use that. Okay, so Blazor server is what we're going to use just because if and a lot of you have asked this question, which web application type should I use? There's a purpose for every different web application type, and every application type has a reason for being. I actually did a course on that called Which ASP.NET Core, where we talked about which version to use. Well, if I have to default, if I don't know a situation, or if I'm going to assume some things, then I'm going to assume that the way to go is Blazor Server, because Blazor Server is kind of like the best of both worlds, both server side and client side. It's got a foot in each, and yet it does both well. So by default, I would choose this for web application over MVC, over Razor Pages. Let's hit create. And once it creates our project, the first thing I do, just to make sure that things are working and that there's no problems, we're going to hit run with IS Express. So this is running. It's going to make sure our application builds, that it runs, and that it looks normal. And it does. Okay, I'm zoomed in here a little bit, so yours will look more like that. But I like to zoom in for my demo so you can actually see the content a little better. So there we go. So our application's working, it's running, there's no problems. We can even go to different pages, increment the counter, fetch the data, and so on. So that's our application. That's how we get started. But let's talk about what are app settings and why are they so important. So right down here we have appsettings.json. Now notice the title of this video is not intro to appsettings.json. It's not the same thing. This is app settings, because this appsettings.json file is one place where we can store settings for our application. But there are actually, by default, 5 locations to store your data. So that's just by default. In the course, I think we create 11 or 12 different locations with different types. Okay, so we're not going to get into all the detail because some of it's a little obscure. For example, INI files, or XML files, or custom JSON files, or in-memory configurations. A lot of stuff we cover in the course. We just don't have time for today, but we're going to talk about 3 of the 5 standard that are built into .NET Core. And all 5 are on by default. That means if you've just been using appsettings.json, this is the last fallback location that you can put data. So there's 4 other places in front of this that you could have put data and override things. So we're going to talk about that in that hierarchy in just a minute. But appsettings.json, we can put information here in a JSON structure. So my setting, this is my setting. Let's actually name it my setting from appsettings.json. Okay. And then what if we had a little more complex setting? Main setting, and then object sub setting. This is my sub setting from appsettings.json. Okay, so these are settings you can have in your application. Now, why would you use settings? Well, your application is going to get compiled once, hopefully. And so if you compile it once, but yet you deploy it to different locations, it is going to have different information depending on where it's deployed to. For instance, if you have a, let's just say a SQL server, and it's going to be different based upon which machine you're on. Maybe it's the production SQL server when it's deployed to the production system. But if it's on the development system, you don't want it pointing to the production system. So you want it pointing to the development SQL server. So that's a different connection string. Or maybe in development, you don't want to send out emails, but in production, your application sends welcome emails to people as they sign up for your application. Well, that would mean you'd have the mail server settings in production, and in development, you'd have maybe a test mail server or something like that. So those settings change just from development to production. But what about if you have a server here where you're located and another one halfway around the world. Maybe they have two different databases they work with, depending on which location they're at. Well, now even your production systems have different configurations or different connection strings to work with. And so you can't put this stuff in your source code because then it is not changeable without recompiling your application. And then you have a nightmare. Which did I compile this for? Is this compiled for production? Is it compiled for development? Is this for production A or production B? Oh no, we got to create a production C. Well, now you got to change everything. Or the server went down, or we have to upgrade our server to a different one. Okay, recompile the entire application. That makes no sense. Beyond that, there's security implications. Because if you put your connection string or other sensitive data into your source code and compile that, that can be decompiled. And it's actually quite easy, especially for custom strings or, strings, because then it can't be obfuscated in any way. So by having your settings in a separate settings file, you can actually encrypt that setting and have it only injected into your application when it's needed. And that's some more advanced stuff that we're not going to cover. We'll talk about a little bit near the end, but we're not going to cover in this video because, again, it's an intro. We do cover it in the in-depth course. I'm not trying to push this course. What I'm saying is I'm just trying to let you know that, yes, there's more to dive in here, but we will cover that in the full in-depth course. Okay, so I have my setting and my subsetting that I want to read into my application. Let's open up the index page. Let's get rid of the survey, even the other stuff. And we'll just say, instead of hello world, we're going to say app settings values. And then we'll create a couple of paragraph tags. If you're not familiar with HTML and paragraph tags, essentially it's just going to wrap this in a paragraph. So it's going to have a space before and after it, like you would see in a Word document with paragraphs. So we're going to read a couple of values here. First is going to be our my setting and then a subsetting. So my setting value, and we'll put that there in just a minute. And then let's copy this whole thing. And we're going to say subsetting value. So we're going to put the values for main setting and subsetting, or my setting and subsetting here. Now, to do this, we have to actually ask for the settings. So we're just going to create a little code section here. And in this code section, we're going to create a couple of strings. String my setting equals, and you know what, let's just put equals empty string for now. And then string subsetting, same thing. Now let's put those values up here. So my setting with an at in front, which is the Razor syntax. And that allows us to put C# code into our HTML, kind of mix the two together. So we're going to have the value for my setting here and the value for subsetting here. Cool. Now we haven't loaded those values yet, so they'll be empty. But we want to load those values. So the first thing I want to do is we need to bring in the configuration, because that's where app settings are set up, and that's where we can access them. Now, I haven't really showed you this. I showed you this in the console app somewhat, but let's quickly look over at program.cs. And in here we have this create host builder. Inside create host builder, we have the create default builder right here, which if I mouse over this, it tells me that's going to configure iConfiguration multiple times. Once for environment variables, then command line appsettings.json with the and appsettings.environment.json and user secrets. And also environment variables down here, and also command line arguments. So multiple things it's doing in here It says environment variables twice because one of them is with the prefix .net underscore. So it's doing a lot of stuff, and that's where this all gets configured. So we don't have to do anything to have all of that configuration done for us. And that's also a hierarchy. What I mean by that is that there's 5 different pieces. There's command line, then there's environment variables, then there is user secrets, then there is the environment specific app settings file, and finally the appsettings.json file, the root one. In that order, we're going to look for the settings we ask for. And so if it finds it in the first one, command line, then it's not going to look anywhere else, and so on. So that's what this sets up. Now, we haven't had to do anything with that. We just have to start asking or ask for the configuration. So at inject iConfiguration. Now it's actually Microsoft.extensions, not configuration, iConfiguration. We'll say underscore config. And this is our dependency injection. Now, if you were in a class somewhere else, let's go to data, and we have the weather forecast service. Yeah, that works. We have the weather forecast, we have the weather forecast service. Well, in here, if I wanted configuration, I would create a constructor, CTOR, and tab twice to create the constructor, and I'd ask for iConfiguration. And notice it adds that using statement up here. And I do the same thing. Config, control dot to create and assign the field, like so. And, oh, it moved it down there. That's weird. They put it down here. But that created the config we can then access anywhere inside this class to be able to access the configuration in this class, asking for it from dependency injection. But since we can say that's fine. We're not actually using it. Since we are inside of a Blazor server page or a Razor component, then we do the at inject instead. It's the same concept as dependency injection through the constructor. So we're injecting this iConfiguration. We're going to call it config. Now, the one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this right here. I don't want to have all of that. So I Control X to cut it out, but I don't have a using statement then for this. Well, I can go over to imports.razor and add a using statement. And that just allows us to have all 10 of these using statements for every Razor page at that level or lower. If you've watched my Blazor server video, intro to Blazor server, or of course my Blazor server in depth course, you will be familiar with that. And if you're not, that adds a using statement essentially to this page. So now iConfiguration is recognized. I can get config. Now let's actually use this to load these 2 values. So down here in the at code section, we're going to say protected override. We're going to say OnInitialized. Now, I get questions often about this because it's technically executed twice on the opening page. So when you first load this website, it's going to, and this is the index page is the home page, or is the main page. So this is the page that's going to be rendered first when you call the website, unless you put a more of the URL than just the main part of the URL. So if we call this page the first time it renders on the page, it's going to call this OnInitialized twice. And that freaks people out sometimes. And the reason it freaks them out is because what if I'm doing data calls in here? And this is the right place to do data calls. You may say, well, but I don't want my data called twice. And I get that. And in some cases, that might not be what you want. In which case, you have 2 options. You can either cache that data, or what you can do is you can turn off server-side rendering. Now, turning off server-side rendering does mean the user will have to wait for the page to be rendered on the client, which is slower. So that's why we render it twice. We render it once on the server and then render a second time on the client to get the fresh data. So the user gets the server-side rendered page quickly. And then in the background, the page re-renders with the newest information on the client. So the user sees the page more quickly, and that's what the purpose of that is. So little side note there, but I want to point that out. If it does freak you out, unless it's a really big problem, leave it alone. Let it render twice. But if it's a really big problem, then you have to make some choices about either writing some complex code or making your users experience more of a load time. And that's not usually a good thing. Part of that too, though, is don't load everything on the first page. Maybe the web is different than desktops. Don't load everything. Only load pieces that you actually need. So sorry, a little bit of soapbox, a little bit of rabbit trail there, but let's get back to the OnInitialized. So let's say my setting equals underscore config dot get value. And this is a string value. And we're going to ask for my setting. There we go. So that's all it's going to take to load from the configuration my setting. Now, if you have come from a .NET framework background where you had app.config or web.config, you might look at this and say, oh, this call right here is pulling from appsettings.json, which technically it is. But unlike the .NET framework, where that was really the only location we pulled from, that will pull from appsettings.json after it is looked in 4 other locations first. And we'll see some of that overriding in just a minute, but let's first just see this load on the page. Now, before we get to that, let's say my subsetting equals underscore config dot get value of type string. Now, what's this going to be? Because we have it in the main setting, but then underneath main setting, this is an object. Inside there is a sub item called subsetting. Well, how do we get that value? Well, in this, we say, in C#, we say main setting colon subsetting. And that's how we get that value. So let's run this and see in action. So it's going to load those 2 values and hopefully display them on the page. There you go. My setting value is, this is my setting from appsettings.json. The subsetting value is, this is my subsetting from appsettings.json. So we've seen now how to load from appsettings.json. And that's really all there is to it. You just ask for get value and the type of data you want to come back, because it can be a bool, it can be an int, a double, a decimal, and so on. In this case, we're asking for strings. Now, there is more nuance here in the fact we can actually load a whole section into a strongly typed object. That's actually usually the recommended way of going. Instead of passing iConfiguration around, you pass a strongly typed object that traditionally is a singleton that has all your data from either a section or your entire settings file, usually a section of your settings file. Now you can put that in dependency injection and you can pass that around. We'll do that in the in-depth course. But for this is probably the most common way of getting one setting. So you just need one setting, boom, there you go. Grab that one setting. Now, connection strings have their own specific one. Let's add one more section here. I want to show you this because connection string is a really common one. So connection string value and let's put this up here and let's ask for the default connection string. So connection string equals config.get connection string for default. You may say, well, Tim, you don't have a default connection string. You're correct. And just to be clear, I want to show this. I've asked for something that's not there. it doesn't crash. It just says it wasn't there, so I have no value. Therefore, well, it has value. It's just not showing. But it has no value to display. There's no data to be displayed. So let's create some data to put in here so we can display the default connection string. Appsettings.json, outside of main setting, we're gonna put a comma. We're gonna say connection strings. And then this is an object. Now note that all of my properties, whether they're the main property or whether they are a property that represents a full object, either way, they're inside of double quotes. That's important. So all these properties, all keys, will be inside of double quotes. The values don't have to be. If a value is a number, then it would not be inside double quotes. The same is true if it's a Boolean. Okay, inside connection strings, and this is important, this is a special key in that you have to spell it correctly with the right casing. So connection strings, it's plural. Inside of here, we can say default. And the value is, this is my connection string from appsettings.json. Now, obviously that's not a connection string, but all the connection string really is, when we get down to it, is a string. So we're gonna use this in place of an actual connection string, just so we can see the value coming through and so we know when we override it. So let's run this again. I haven't changed anything else, but I was asking for a default connection string. And now we see that connection string value says, this is my connection string from appsettings.json. Okay, so we've now read from our configuration, both in just the root, as well as a sub value, as well as a connection string. Honestly, if you stop there, you've got a lot of information to use, and you can make use of app settings in .NET Core. But there's a lot more depth here, and even though there's a lot more depth, we're still only going to scratch the surface. So let's go into a little more depth, because there's a little bit more that I want to talk about as far as using this to your advantage. You see, not everything can go into appsettings.json. If you work with a team, even if you don't, you should be using source control. Specifically, you should use Git. Now, if you are not familiar with Git, I'd recommend you get used to it because it is the de facto standard for source control in the industry, not just in .NET, but across the board. It's the #1 source control management system on the planet. It's free. I have a video on this channel called, I believe, Intro to Git. You can check that out. It's about 2 hours where I go really in depth in getting started with Git and getting to know the commands. Because once you know the commands and the structure, which it sounds a little scary, it's actually a really powerful tool. But if you're using source control, then appsettings.json goes into source control. That's a good thing from the perspective of all of your settings, all of your configuration, all that structure will be saved in case you have to back up or overwrite or change something. It's not a good thing if you're trying to put sensitive data there. Now, let's talk about what is sensitive data. There's different kinds. There's developer sensitive data. For instance, if I want to connect this application to my local SQL server, my local DB, I'd grab one of these databases, and let's just grab, it doesn't really matter which one. And let's open this up and go to properties. And in here would be connection string right there. I could copy that and I could paste that into my app settings. Okay, that would be something I want to keep kind of to myself. It's not the same thing as secret, because if you notice, integrated security equals true. I'm not passing off a username and password in here. And even if I did, which I could on my development machine, even if I put my username and password, it'd be for my development SQL server. So not the end of the world if somebody else has it. However, this is not the same settings. This is not the same connection string that my coworker might have for this same application when they are developing it. Therefore, I don't want to give this in or put this in a source control, because then it overwrites my coworker's setting, and now they have to redo it or not download this file in order to make sure that they have their set up for their machine. So development settings aren't necessarily secret, but we do want to keep them to ourselves. So that's one kind of secrecy. And that's what we're going to deal with today when we talk about user secrets. But then the other type is production security. When you're talking about putting an actual connection string in here that has a username and password to the production database. That we probably don't want anybody to have access to, maybe not even our developers. And for that, we want to deal with something a little bit more advanced, like either Azure App Settings, the environment variable override, and other hosts do the same thing with environment variables and overriding. Those are usually, I can't speak for every host, but for Azure, I know that they are encrypted at rest and encrypted during transmission to your application, and that only the people who have access to your production server setup will have access to those usernames and passwords. If you want to go a step further, Azure Key Vault, which also integrates with app settings. And it's just one more thing you add to app settings, one more place to look. Azure Key Vault encrypts at rest, encrypts during transmission, and isn't even visible to your web server administrators. It's super locked down. And we're going to cover that in the in-depth course as well. So that's kind of the server side of things, the production side, but that's for the end of the road. Before that point, we have things we want to keep separate at least, whether it be our development server or our staging server, our QA server, our testing server. Those are things we want to keep separate, but not necessarily secret. So that's where two more types or two more places to look for settings come in. In the first one, if we expand app settings over here, there's actually a file underneath it called appsettings.development.json. This is only used if your application is running in development mode. Now, what is development mode and how do you know if you're running in it? Good question. And the answer is actually not if you're running in Visual Studio. It may seem that way, but that's not what it means to be in development mode for this. Instead, if you go to properties, you expand properties, you see launch settings.json. You'll notice IIS settings right here for IIS Express, and then also appsettings.demo. So IIS actually has part up here and then part down here, whereas app settings demo, which is actually Kestrel, that has all the settings right in here. So that's our two options here, IIS Express and app settings demo, which is Kestrel. These are our two web servers in Visual Studio for development. Well, for both of these, we'll see environment variables. And one environment variable is being set. ASP.NET Core _ environment is development. That's for both of them. That's what's setting us up to be in development mode, is that environment variable. So with that being set, we will look at appsettings.development.json before we look at app settings. So if there's a setting in here, it will override the setting in appsettings.json. Let me prove this to you. Let's grab just this setting, my setting. Let's paste that We're going to put a comma and paste it in here. And we'll say, this is from appsettings.development.json. Now we haven't put any other setting in here, just that one. Let's run this application. Now notice this is my setting from appsettings.development.json. The other two are still from appsettings.json. But because we put that one setting in the appsettings.development.json file, it overwrote this one. Now, why is that valuable? Why is it valuable to have two different places, one for development, one for what seemed like just a regular one? Well, we're not always in development mode. This file is probably one you share with your entire team. So you check this into source control, probably. You can choose. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but probably you do. And what this will be is it will override all the settings that might otherwise be something either sensitive or might configure your application in a way that you wouldn't want to do for development. For example, sending email. You don't want to do that in development. Now, what I typically do is, let's say for connection string, I would probably blank this out. I wouldn't have anything in here in appsettings.json. But then in my development JSON, I would have a value because that would be for my development server. And it'd probably be a server that all of my developers would point to when they're developing against the central development system. For when we publish to a development server, that would be the settings we'd use. So that's probably what I'd do. But then what would happen is if we publish to production, well, in production, we don't have this environment variable being set. And if it's not set at all, then by default, it's production, which means that we will not read from appsettings.development.json. We would read from appsettings.production.json. So here's the cool thing. We could actually put a file on the server, on the production server, that is not in source control, that is not seen by any of the developers, but that has some production settings in it. And those would override appsettings.json. So that might be a solution. Just create an appsettings.production.json and put just the settings in there that need to be sensitive. Now, I mentioned that I would blank out connection strings in my appsettings.json. Just leave the default here as empty. And then I'd change that for development, for production, for other environments. But there is a point to having appsettings.json, this fallback, because some settings, like maybe my setting, we can have the same value for production, for development, for everything else. Because maybe it's something as simple as how many days are in a week. We need to define that for some reason in a setting file. Well, no problem. That doesn't need to change for development versus production. And if we really need to change it for testing purposes, we could change that in appsettings.development.json and not affect anything else. Okay, so development overrides our app setting, but only when this is marked as development. Let's just try taking this setting out entirely. So ISExpress does not have that environment variable. Remember, I'm still overriding that first value. Well, I'm actually not, because it's not looking at appsettings.development.json anymore. It's looking at appsettings.production.json, which we don't have. And it's okay. It says we don't find it, no problem, just skip it. Now, again, we'll cover that in creating one of those files, which is really easy. Just create the file, name it appsettings.production.json. You're good to go. Make sure it's copying it over to the output directory. But we'll cover that in the full course as well. So that's how you deal with app settings for development versus production. You can create other ones like staging or pre-production and have settings for each of those different locations. That allows you to take your source code, the same source code, and deploy it from a development server to a staging server to a pre-production server to a production server without changing any settings. Because you've already set them once. You don't need to keep changing them. You don't have to have the same settings that you then tweak every different location. Nope. They're already set once, and you can deploy to all different environments, and it will work. So that's a big deal benefit of app settings. So I said that we probably check in this appsettings.development.json into source control. But that still leaves me the question of, how about my local database? You remember I said I might not want to have this in appsettings.json or even appsettings.development.json because it would affect my coworkers who have a different URL or a different path to their development database, their local development database. What do I do then? Well, that's where user secrets come in. If you right-click on your project and say Manage User Secrets, it's going to create a new JSON file called secrets.json. Now, how you access this file is by right-clicking and saying Manage User Secrets. So that's how you get to it every time. There isn't a shortcut over here on the right. There isn't a file somewhere. It's just that one setting. And the reason why is because this file isn't stored with the rest of your project. This is on your machine only. It will not get checked into source control. It can't be because it's not even in the same path. It's somewhere totally different. In fact, you mouse over it, notice it says users/me, which is my login name, /appdata/roaming/Microsoft/user secrets/aguid/secrets.json. So that's this file here. This is where you put files that are specific to your machine. So your local development stuff. And that's for this specific app. So it'd be a different secrets.json for a different app. So in here, I could, instead of having this section right here, let's just grab just this one. Actually, you know what? Let's grab both of them. And put it into secrets.json. Now remember that I'm back in development mode. So I should have, let's cut this out and make sure. I should have the development.json, appsettings.development.json overriding that first value again. So remember, or up here, this is back to, my setting is back to being from appsettings.development.json, which overrides the appsettings.json value. Well, if I put values in secrets.json, and let's override two of them, and I run this application again, now this is from secrets.json, and this is from secrets.json. So notice that the secrets.json is higher up the food chain, if you will, from the appsettings.development.json and from appsettings.json. There's the hierarchy. User secrets come before either of those. Now, console, command line parameters, and also environment variables are even above these two, or these three. But this is the highest one we're going to talk about today, because these are the common ones you're going to deal with. So this is appsettings or secrets.json. It's really for your local environment. Now, I just want to be very clear about something. This is not encrypted. This is a clear text file. Now, don't try to encrypt it because there's not a point. This is stored on your profile. The only time you can have access to this file is if you're logged in as you. Therefore, this is protected by Windows, just like any of your other documents. If your other documents are unsecure, that means that your login is unsecure. You need to fix that. But otherwise, this is secure for your machine. Therefore, you can put stuff in here that is local stuff. It's stuff that is for local settings. Your local username and password for your database, your local configuration for your email server, probably one of those local host email servers that allows you to see the emails without actually sending any. maybe your local settings for other configuration stuff. This is not for corporate sensitive stuff, because you shouldn't have that probably on your machine in clear text anyway. That's where you'd use an Azure Key Vault to store that stuff. So this is for your local settings. The appsettings.development.json, that's for your team development server, development environment. The app settings is for your overall application for things that don't need to be overridden. Or if they do, you can still override them in the other settings, but maybe by default, they're not overridden. So like I said, the 7 days in a week, that's probably standard for everything, right? But there may be a case where you want to test to make sure that if you change that, it didn't break everything. Well, you would test that by overriding it either in secrets.json or appsettings.development.json. So that's how app settings works. That's how you work with it. This video mainly is focused on the process for working in development and staging and testing. It's not gone into production stuff. And I did that intentionally because for the most part, you'll be working with development code. Once you get to the point where you need to deploy it, that's when you should already be working in a team environment where you have a better handle on how to deal with the DevOps processes, how to inject new values or encrypted values in the CI/CD pipeline, or use the environment variables that are encrypted for Azure App Services, or use Key Vault or something else like that. Like I said, I've covered all of this for both development and production in my course. There's a lot to cover. There's a lot more we haven't gone into. We haven't done custom files. We haven't talked about how to do environment variables or command line settings, or security on the production side, all that kind of good stuff. So there's a lot more to go into, but this gets you pretty much all the way there for building applications. This is all you need to create a great, robust system for storing your data that would change per environment, or that might change more often than you rebuild your application. So any kind of setting that your application has should probably be pulled out and put into app settings, because that way allows your application to be configured or changed or tweaked without having to be rebuilt. And that's what they're for. Fortunately, we've gone from what we had in .NET Framework, which was okay with app.config and web.config, to something that is amazing in app settings. We have so much power here, but it starts off so simple to use. You just need to ask for that I configuration and then say get value. That's really all you have to do to get started. But then as you go deeper, you can have these different configurations for different environments and really grow. And yeah, the complexity grows a little bit, but it's going to grow a little bit while your application's complexity grows a lot more. So like I said, I'm a big fan of app settings. I think that Microsoft has hit a home run here, both with creating a system that is flexible and easy to configure and grow and make more complex, really, with a lot of different options, including your own custom options, where maybe you don't even have a normal type of file. You can still read it and put it into app settings. But yet, with all that complexity, with all those different options you could do, Microsoft has chosen some great defaults and made it so easy to use that you just ask for it and then use it. And that's it to get started. So I really encourage you to try this out, play with it, get to know it, and don't just stop at appsettings.json. Really get to know the different environments, because this is what sets apart the hobbyist who never works with anybody else from the person who is ready to work with other developers, who's ready to interview for a job, who's ready to get in and start working in an environment that is more than just you. So thanks for watching. If you want to go deeper in this, I do have the app settings, the .NET Core app settings in-depth course to check out. Remember, it's on discount through the end of the month only. So check that out quick if you're interested. Thanks for watching. Share, like it. Give me a comment down below what your thoughts are. And as always, I am Tim Corey.